Okay, here we go. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Seminar on Social Movements and Political Action of the CIES Research Center of ISCTE. Thank you, Lisa and Manuela, who I hope will arrive soon, for accepting to be our speakers for today's session. And for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, this is a monthly seminar series that has been running since October 2014, so for almost 12 years now. It was founded by Guia Cornero and Britta Baumgarten and was created as a space for a multidisciplinary reflection and debate around social movements, collective action, and activism. We are now about to go on our summer break for a while. This is our last session before the break, but we will return again in September. And one of the main aims of this seminar is to bring different perspectives, methodologies, and research traditions into conversation. And not only connecting Western approaches and debates, but also paying attention to cases and regions that are often less visible in the field, such as in the global South and Sub-Saharan Africa. All of our sessions are recorded since most of the time they are hybrid and you can follow them online. So you can see the recording of them again later or use them for a class or your own studies. As you can see in the page of the seminar, you just have to click on the page of a previous session and you have access to the video. And our format is usually very open and conversational. We begin with a presentation, followed by commentaries, and then open discussion with everyone present. In this case today on the virtual room. And the idea is not only to present research, but to create a collective space for debate. So today's session is titled Beyond Euroscepticism, Radical Left and Right Visions of Europe Across Party and Protest Arenas. We are very pleased to welcome Lisa Sophie Fenner from the University of Amsterdam and Manuela Caiani from the Cosmos Center of Social Movement Studies of Scuola Normale Superiore, who will now be presented by Guia. We can't hear you, Guia.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, Raffaele, for introducing the seminar series. We have here in the room also someone else who already presented, Jacopo Custodi. So it's really the objective is really to create a community of discussion and dialogue around these topics. And we are very happy to have you today, Lisa. I don't know if Manuela is already arrived, but in any case, we are also happy to have you here, Manuela, wherever you are in this moment. So some few words on our today guest, Lisa Fenner. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and she works on a very crucial topic, which is artificial intelligence and politics. Particularly, she researches civil society influence on European Union artificial intelligence regulation and grassroots contestation and protest against artificial intelligence data centers. She received a PhD in 2024 at the University of Cambridge, and her book, based on this PhD dissertation, The Mechanism of Protest Impact in the European Union, on the mechanism of protest impact. I don't know if this is the right title, but in any case, the important thing is coming out with Belgrave next week. So congratulations, Lisa, also for this. So Manuela Caiani, she's an associate professor in political science at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence and affiliate scholar at the Cosmos Center for Social Movement Studies. She has a very extensive work in areas connected to populism, right-wing, radical right-wing, far right-wing movements, Euroscepticism, and many different topics related to these issues. Her book, co-authored with Donatella Porto in 2009, Social Movements and Europeanization, published with Oxford University Press, has been until now a path-breaking book in this area. It's still a fundamental reading for everybody that would like to address these topics. and she's now she has some other many other books, and now there are some edited books are forthcoming, co-edited by Manuela, Caiani, and other authors, particularly the Oxford Book of Social Movements of the Far Right, the Conspiracies, the edited book Conspiracy and Political Conflict, and a book I think is also very important that is now published in Italian, but for sure there is also kind of rising a discussion around this topic, radical right and climate change, the new frontier. So you have the floor. Thank you once again for being with us, and you can share the screen. Lisa.
Yeah. Super. Does that work?
Yeah, perfect.
Super. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Really excited to be in this super cool series that you organize. Yeah, so today I will present an article that Manuela and I wrote together called Beyond Euroscepticism, Radical Left and Right Visions of Europe Across Party and Protest Arenas. And while this particular article has now been published, we are working currently on an expansion for a short book where we focus less on parties but more on movements, and also look at their networks and online communication strategies. Basically, yeah, revisiting Europeanization from below 20 years after the first book. And so any and all comments are super appreciated. Yeah, grateful that you're here to discuss today. So this paper that I'm presenting today starts from an empirical observation, basically, so that we in the last decades have seen a strong rise of radical right mobilizations across Europe, here seen on the right. And then at the same time, and to some extent in response to that, we have seen many progressive social movements that have mobilized for Europe, and specifically against nationalist turns that we've seen, that are, though, themselves quite critical of the EU. What's interesting, though, is that these progressive movements, they've often claimed a very specific and very explicit European identity. But quite recently, the radical right is also increasingly presenting itself as explicitly European. So here, for example, we see the identitarians with their Future for Europe, Zukunft für Europa banner there, or Pegida, the patriot Europeans against the Islamification of the Occident, have it even in their name. And so we have this contested space here now, that where we have movements on the left and on the right, both really engaging intensely in this European space and claiming this European identity. And so our goal in this paper was to understand these competing visions, basically, but along political, cultural, and economic dimensions, and crucially across party and protest arenas. And maybe just as a backdrop that to see where we're coming from, we also see this basically as happening now while we have generally declining public trust in the EU, and we've had this for many years, which we think makes it even more important to look at bottom-up visions of what Europe actually is and should be in these contestations, to then understand how that might actually shape European politics and policies into the future. Yeah, intellectual or literature-wise, we start with two literatures. So we hope to bridge party politics literature and social movement studies, because we argue that actually they share quite the same root, right? In both we see that Europe and the EU are politicized from below, but they've quite developed in parallel. So on the one hand, we have the party politics scholars. Of course, as the name says, they look more at parties and more on the right. And the key concept here is the Euroscepticism one, which has become so defining for the whole field in the last 20, 30, soon 30 years. And so early on, Euroscepticism just meant, opposition to European integration. But very soon this was refined further and further until it turned into, one could call it a varieties of Euroscepticism. So, for example, Taggart and Scherbiak made this distinction between soft and hard Euroscepticism. There were there's this conceptualizations that we'd have to differentiate between Europe in principle versus the current situation of the EU. And also one conceptualization that was quite helpful is to think of a spectrum where we have the Euro rejects on one end that are really fundamentally against this idea of a European Union. Somewhere in the middle, Eurosceptics with a more multifaceted identity, and then Euro enthusiasts on the other end of the spectrum, very much in favor of European integration. More recently, colleagues such as Pierre and Van Kessel, they have added that actually we do need to think not in a binary, but along more dimensions and facets, for example, cultural legitimacy issues, socioeconomic issues, the question of sovereignty, and disentangle that. And that's where we also latch on. And then in the social movement studies, I'm sure this is also more the literature that all we in the seminar here are more familiar with. There was more of a focus on left progressive movements that were quite critical, but not against the EU as a whole. And concepts such as critical Europeanism were central here, Euro alternativism, radical Euro criticism, or more recently, Euro disenchantment. And to maybe add to that, of course, there's also a whole vast literature on public opinion, for example, by some colleagues of mine here at the UvA, for example, Claes de Vreese, who also show that if you look at citizen opinion on the EU now, it has many, many facets. For example, they also look at political, cultural, economic dimensions of attitudes towards Europe. So that's then our starting point. So we argue that to understand the current contestations of Europe, we need to connect these literatures because clearly they're talking about very similar things. We need to look at the full spectrum of actors together, and we need concepts that can capture these visions of Europe, but that don't collapse into two simple binaries between pro or anti-EU positions. So in this conceptualization, we start out with Benedict Anderson and Europe as an imagined community. So we conceptualize Europe as this imagined concept that nonetheless has become quite central and very contested terrain of political identity formation. And we build on Manuela's previous work with Mannes Weiskircher, where they've already created this distinction between anti-nationalist Europeans versus European nativists. We then, though, in this paper, extend this framework to cover not just movements, but also parties and citizens. And we think that it's helpful to structure these visions of Europe along three dimensions. A political dimension, there we look at questions of sovereignty, legitimacy, membership with the EU. And then at the cultural dimension, where it's more about this civilizational idea of Europe and who belongs to Europe and who does not belong to Europe in this imaginary, and an economic dimension that revolves around this idea of market Europe. And beforehand, we expected that political actors on the left or anti-nationalist Europeans would display political visions that emphasize the democratic quality of the EU or the lack thereof, that have cultural visions that are open, inclusive, and economic visions that are quite critical of neoliberalization, that call for less globalization, more transnational benefits, and so on. And then for the political actors on the right, or the pro-European nativist, we expected political visions that call for more sovereignty for the nation state, for cultural visions that are based on an ethnical conception of Europe and that are exclusionary, and for economic visions that are selective, so in favor of some benefits, but only if they're advantageous to the nation states. In the empirically, we combined a lot of field work we've both done and data work in the last years. So we constructed a diverse case comparative design where we really try to maximize the variation between our cases. So we look at three member state countries and 2 candidate countries. And with Italy, we have a founding member state, but also 2 post-2004 member states with Poland and Slovenia. And then we have the EU candidates, North Macedonia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then we, of course, also study 3 different types of actors. So we have 12 different parties where we looked at national election manifestos that talked about Europe. Maybe important to mention here that how we got to this number 12 was indeed that we looked at national party manifestos, and then we had to reject all of them that didn't speak about Europe, which is a frequent occurrence. And I'd be very interested to discuss more about that later, how one can deal with that. And then we looked at also 3 social movements that were directed at the EU directly. They were all on the left. And then we also looked at activists and citizens that were parts of civil society or party groups, both on the left and on the right. There we had 44 in-depth interviews in 22 focus groups with 113 participants across all the five countries. Now, this is, of course, a whole bunch of empirical data. So to bind this all together in a way that made sense, we did a frame analysis of Europe. So we coded every reference across all of our material that referenced Europe or the EU or anything European in any way. Then we classified these as either political, cultural, or economic. And then after that, we inductively looked at what type of subtopics then emerged and selected, of course, illustrative quotes. So now into the what we actually found. So we're going to start with the pro-European nativists on their political dimension. So there's clearly a core vision that defends national sovereignty against EU overreach. And in general, the EU is seen as elite-driven. And then it depended a bit on the case, but in general, this elite or this domination was seen to come from the old states, so founding members, or then, in the case of Italy, from north. So that, in this case, was Germany or France. And then the preferred model that came up again and again was a much looser union that was really just focused on very limited common tasks. And so, for example, we have this one supporter from Homeland League in Slovenia that said in a focus group, well, the EU should focus on security and economic coordination, leaving the rest to sovereign nations. Today, the EU is a hybrid drifting toward a federation. That really, this fear of more integration of a federation, that really cut across most our groups that and also party manifestos on the pro-European nativist side. Cultural visions, this was clearly a very distinct European identity that comes out here, but defined in very narrow terms. So defined as Christian, traditional, ethnically bounded. There's this distinction between Europe as a civilization and the EU as a liberal cosmopolitan bureaucracy. And this distinction is made very explicitly and a lot. When it comes to migration, minority rights, migration are central flashpoints here, often with very moralizing terms, moral decay, Islamification as seen as a threat of Europe. Here, Law and Justice, the party in Poland, in their manifesto, for example, said that the union should be built on the permanent roots of civilizational identity. European civilization has a magnificent Greco-Roman Christian root, not social constructivism or primitive experiments in civilization. And then moving to the economic visions, that was to some extent the most surprising because these are not anti-market or anti-single market sentiments by any means, but the economic visions that really came through were a conditioned support for market integration, quite as in that sense as we expected, that if it benefits national economies, but also explicitly argued that the current setup just benefits the North and old member states too much. The euro is rigged in favor of Germany and multinational firms, but of course the benefits in general are quite appreciated. Law and Justice even says it explicitly: the common market and the free movement of people, goods, capital, and services are the most important achievements of the union. So if there's anything positive to be seen about this union, then it is actually these market things and the benefits that come with it. At the same time, for example, this North Macedonian respondent I found also very interesting, who said, well, yeah, with these European working hours, we can maintain our traditional values. So here, clearly also the more, the neoliberal EU is in conflict with some economies here, and is seen as infringing on what is seen as a traditional and wanted setup. But let's move over to the anti-nationalist Europeans. So these are more the progressive movements that are EU-directed in our case, but also the parties. The core vision here is one of a Europe that is that has more integration still, but in a much more democratic and social way. So there's also this elitist critique here, that the EU is ruled by technocratic elites, and that there's a demand for transparency and accountability. This was especially the case for all three movements that we looked at against ACTA, TTIP, and the Copyright Directive. These were the absolute flashpoints, this lack of transparency, this lack of responsiveness and accountability. And this is then turned into a positive claim, like a demand for, we need a more democratic union. This is not questioning EU-level competencies at all, but it's that the way that decisions are made must be much more open. Slovenian Social Democratic Party formulated it this as a chance in that sense, where they said that we need to build a progressive, social, just, and secure European society, deepening democracy and rigorously implementing human rights. We need to give the European idea a new lease of life. And this European idea here is, of course, very interesting because it is given this connotation of actually this is what we think Europe is and should stand for, a social, democratic, human rights oriented union. The cultural visions were, maybe as a first point, much less pronounced than on the pro-European nativist side. This was quite hard to distill at times, but where it shone through, so to say, Europe was presented as a space of civil liberties, of pluralism and openness. There were, of course, lots of references to migration, and here Fortress Europe was critiqued. For example, in Slovenia was mentioned the razor wire has grown on the Schengen border, and restrictive migration rules were criticized. The movements, of course, the movements we looked at here are not in that sense cultural movements, but these were about trade agreements, ACTA and TTIP, or intellectual property rights, the Copyright Directive. So what we did see in terms of more cultural notions, if you want, was that digital rights and, for example, open internet access were framed often as core European principles, but in reference to not being US values, especially around TTIP. And this was something we're European and not American. This was also something that came through in these movements in the economic visions. So there was strong support for deeper economic integration with much stronger social standards, a lot of critique of neoliberal Europe and race to the bottom dynamics. For example, the Slovenian left in the party manifesto said that European neoliberalism has led to a lack of common social standards and a dismantling of the welfare state. The TTIP protests in particular articulated a very clear anti-neoliberal vision of Europe as a regulator that should protect its citizens from corporate power. So these were the main pictures. To conclude, I'll try to wrap up the main and key patterns that we did see. So one striking pattern is that for the pro-European nativist, there's a very strong distinction between the EU and Europe that are not the same. And respondents, especially in the focus groups and in the interviews, often explicitly made a point about this, literally saying, we're European, but we're not the EU. The EU isn't even anything that could give one an identity. Versus when we look at the anti-nationalist Europeans, EU and Europe are indeed used interchangeably often in the parties, but also in the movement documents. We also saw very consistent ideological visions across the arenas. Most notable were the movement party parallels, which is, on the one hand, one would think not too surprising because these lines are more and more blurred. And we also think this could suggest that there is strong potential for coalition building between those arenas. But what was interesting and struck us, and would also be interesting to discuss more, is that there was very little cross-referencing in what we actually had. So parties did not much refer to any of the movements, for example, especially on the left, and vice versa. And the third pattern is that we did also see considerable variation across countries. And this is especially with reference to the pro-European nativists, where we have the member states where there was very clear move towards away from rejectionism and more towards reformism, whereas the candidate states, there were strong sentiments still against actual EU accession or into joining the EU, and notions of we need to actually see whether we want to align differently geopolitically if Europe forever keeps us in the waiting room for the EU. What cut across left and right and all actors and countries was that this elitist critique of the EU. So that it's too neoliberal, too elitist, Brussels elite, technocracy, neoliberal policies. These were key words and themes that came up again and again, but they did pull in different directions in the end. Where the pro-European nativists, they used this critique to justify repatriating powers, shielding national economies, getting more national sovereignty back. And the anti-nationalist Europeans used it more to argue, for more democratic integration, for more redistributive policies, and stronger EU-level rights, social rights. So to conclude, we think that this framework is really helpful to unpack how a wide, very different range of actors imagine Europe along these different dimensions. And we found that it traveled quite well across our different arenas and different regions. A possible limitation that we do see is that this use of national election manifestos did not leave that much to work with. And of course, we thought, we could, of course, use European election manifestos where it's much more about Europe and we'd have many more parties to look at. However, of course, having some candidate countries, that we in the end decided that this was going to be more a cleaner approach to really focus on the national election manifestos and see what we have there. Going forward, one area I think is particularly interesting is to look more into this lack of cross-referencing, because clearly they are so blurred now and they are so aligned ideologically in what we had. To find out, and maybe we can also discuss this, why is that? And also in light of current developments, we started thinking about whether actually we would need to start thinking of geopolitical vision as a fourth dimension. I'd be interested to hear what you think. But for now, thank you very much, and I'm interested and excited to hear your comments and questions.
Okay, so you would like to stop sharing maybe? Lisa?
Super.
So thank you very much, Lisa, for this very interesting and very precise presentation on your work. So we can open the floor for comments, questions, suggestions, and anything else. Since you also are saying that you have another project ongoing, developing this the core of this article, right?
So, exactly, we do.
So we would like to start. So maybe just to Jacopo, go ahead.
Perhaps if I can just ask a question, just as a follow-up to the discussion. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. No, I just wanted to ask you if you could spend a few words more about the relation between this dichotomy that you developed between pro-European nativists and anti-nationalist Europeans, and the dichotomy you have in the title of the article, which is radical left and radical right. So, because those are different things, I just wanted to understand better how you combine those two divisions, if they match or not.
Yes, I mean, they do. And I agree that, yeah, this is also something we keep thinking, or I keep thinking about now going forward with where we expand on this, that, of course, we want to exactly escape collapsing into this binary, but it does match quite neatly, so that we have the radical left movements that we looked at least really fall quite straightly into the anti-nationalist European side along all of the dimensions. Mm-hmm. And the same on the other side, that the radical left right really mapped onto this pro-European nativist side. And so I hope that, yeah, by carving out really the different dimensions here, we can make sure to not collapse too much and to just saying, well, clearly what we don't want to do is to say any is pro or anti-European. Clearly they're all critical in different ways. But this left-right dimension so far has indeed mapped onto that pretty straightforwardly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Someone else? Rafael?
Lisa, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. I have two short questions. One is about framing, and the second is about collective identity. So, first of all, your study separates political, cultural, and economic dimensions of Europe. Do you find that one of these dimensions works more strongly as a mobilizing frame than the others in the countries you studied, and why? And second question, can we say that both the radical left and radical right are building European collective identities, but with opposite boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, regardless who can count as part of that vision, that idea of what is an European identity?
Oh, it's really cool questions. Thank you so much. If any, yeah, the mobilizing, that was the first question, right? If any of those dimensions work more strongly, definitely on the right, this cultural one is the one that's most strongly working, is the mobilizing one. 100%, yeah. On the left, you can also see it if you just compare the sheer amount of reference. This is so focused on the cultural one, and that, of course, I think is also an indicator that that's the one that is has the most traction and the most mobilizing potential. On the left, it's a bit more difficult. So especially for the three movements, because they were all so technical from the outset, with trade negotiations, copyright, that's not something that's in the first instance either of these really. And you can see that these movements really made an effort to reframe these in the first instance to make them in any way able to mobilize. And I would say that the strongest one there is probably the political one, that is really about more social democratic nature of policymaking, better responsiveness, more inclusion, less elite driven politics. Yeah, the second one, the building of the European identity. Yeah, what an interesting question. I wish, I think Manuela hasn't joined, right? I think she could probably say more on that, because she works, of course, mainly on the right, whereas I work on the left. But what I understand is that, that there is indeed, this is a still very fragmented space. Even if they use similar, for example, in Austria and Germany, these groups use similar frames, but then the actual organization and the networks are still incredibly fragmented and not very transnational at all.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Someone else? So maybe I wanted to just follow this Raffaella question about the European identity. I don't know if you, well, maybe you mentioned that, but maybe this escaped me. But about this, the role that even right-wing Euroscepticism is able to consolidate a European public sphere, because it's the way as it is discussed in the national public sphere, like a kind of transnational problem, an issue, at the end up to have a kind of backlash of the view of of course, the Eurosceptical actors. But I also wanted to ask you about your last point about the geopolitical dimension that you would like to develop. I'm kind of curious, particularly given the current context. Also, well, we are really in a critical moment for Europe, and so if it's related to that, or what you this axis that you think that is worth to be explored.
Yeah, I think it is the very recent ones, but also, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think, is already the first sparking point there, where we do see, of course, in, for example, the candidate countries, it's quite contested who should we align ourselves with. And is the EU still the one for different reasons, we should be aligning ourselves with? And yeah, even more so now, I think, with NATO becoming more brittle, and yeah, different allegiances. Of course, you see in the radical right parties of a lot of these show the allegiances towards Russia, some towards, of course, the American government. And yeah, I think this is going to be an even more contested space probably than it maybe has been before, that what it means to be not just European inside of Europe, but European as an actor onto the global stage.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this is our idea to go forward. I think maybe it's also one that we can't ignore. But yeah, I've of course not actually started unpacking.
Mm-hmm.
Also not something, to be honest, that has been incredibly present in the materials we looked at, but then these were also older, of course. I think this would also warrant looking at more recent manifestos and campaigns to get a better sense, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about the recent days, about the kind of paradoxical reaction, not paradoxical, but a kind of also understandable reaction of Italian government under the kind of crazy attacks of Trump, and how this made them turn more to Europe. So how this kind of global context can actually end up in kind of challenging the idea of sovereignty and of these actors, and how they react to this in a certain way. But maybe it's still very early and to address this point. Some more questions? Comments? Maybe there is something else that you would like to add to? There is something you would like to add to that you weren't able to rise before, maybe because of the time of the presentation?
Yeah, maybe also I'd be interested in what you think of the structure of how we build this. So now the way it's structured is that we draw these dimensions from previous work, and then we go and have looked at our cases accordingly. And do you find that convincing and helpful, or would you think it more helpful to switch this around and start in the field, and then see how we come back to the dimensions? Or did you find that is that enough to theoretically derive these like that?
Someone like to. Is there any?
Yeah, okay, so I'll have another question after.
Okay, perhaps if I can jump in. I mean, it's partially related. I think the distinction that you use, it works, so I would encourage you to keep it. Makes sense to me. What I'm just a bit not so convinced, and so perhaps could be something that you could reconsider for further studies, is this distinction that I was mentioning before between radical left and radical right. Because, I was looking at the cases that you look at, and actually most of those parties are not radical left, but nor radical right either. I mean, some of them are center left or center right. Up of all the 12 political parties that you use, I think there is just one that would fit as radical left. And I mean, this is absolutely not a problem. I mean, it's still very interesting, and actually having a more plural corpus is simply better, actually. So it's not a big deal, but perhaps it would make more sense to, like, for future researches, to just not categorize all your actors in just radical left or radical right. Also because this allows you to look at more pluralism between the whole spectrum, not just between the two poles, no?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you. I'm minded to agree, and I think with the data, of course, we were driven also by within what we had. Yeah, but I agree. It's worth thinking about whether we actually want to maybe drop the radical. Yeah, because I am also not too inclined, of course, to go too much into this, hammer too much into this actual divide and put them so much across from each other either. Yeah, thank you. With the country cases, do you feel that this is an appropriate selection, or is there a region of Europe that would be helpful to actually add that we could expect to look different?
Rafael, you're smiling.
Should I reply? I don't know. No, I mean, I don't know. Perhaps something that would make sense would be to maximize pluralism based on actors and not so much based on countries. So I would look at, like, parties that represent different positions within the political spectrum, which is something that you already do, but you don't justify it or present it as a starting point, But actually, I think it's a good starting point to say that you take, like, two radical left, two center left, two center right, two radical right. Something like that could perhaps also brings you more pluralism, maybe. Because, like, for example, something that I found in my studies on the radical left was that you do have some radical left parties that are Eurosceptic and others that are not, and this is something that you already know. But you also have some radical left parties that do use patriotism and others that do not. But the interesting thing was that those two elements do not necessarily match. So you have actors that are, like, highly Eurosceptic, but not highly patriotic. And actors that are highly patriotic, or at least quite patriotic, let's say, but not at all Eurosceptic. So the two variables are not, like, necessarily aligned. In some cases were, and some cases not. So, more cases you bring in, more plurality you get. But this plurality is, like, the juice here. It's the interesting part. So
super interesting. Could you tell me what would be an example of the patriotic radical left movement or party?
For example, in the early years, Podemos used a lot a patriotic strategy. They were like claiming a lot to like represent their homeland, to defend the homeland, that their adversaries were like traitor of the country and so on.
Was that a Communist Party in Portugal too?
Exactly. But the difference is that the Portuguese Communist Party is quite Eurosceptic.
Yeah.
But Podemos, especially in those years, was not. Of course, they were like critical of austerity, European institutions, and so on. But within a traditional alter Europeanist left-wing framework, not in the same way as the Communist Party in Portugal, for example.
Well, if we want to, sorry, I interrupt you, Jacopo.
No, please, jump in.
No, I was thinking that maybe, but this can add a big complexity, and maybe it's too much. But I think also to look at nationalism, how they use Europe in kind of internal discourse, for instance, in Catalonia or in Scotland, or how is used against the national state, the central state also.
Yeah.
And if I can just add one last thing, I mean, on this same line of reasoning, there is also an opposite case. For example, the radical left in Italy, specifically Potere al Popolo, which is very tiny, but still it's the biggest radical left actor we have. Potere al Popolo is highly Eurosceptic, especially on the years in which the topic was more at the center of the agenda. So after 2018 and so on, the party was highly Eurosceptic. But at the same time, they never used any kind of patriotic rhetoric whatsoever, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Ah, fascinating. Thank you.
Yes, so maybe a typology of attitudes more than on parties, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I was also thinking maybe that what we don't have yet, but what might be interesting is a territorial more approach of what is Europe, like a more land mention, if that makes sense. Because of course the political one that we have so far, this is more about sovereignty, legitimacy, not so much about which is the land. Maybe that's where the patriotism comes into.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, you have things in social psychology working on that. Like here in Lisbon, our colleague Paula Castro, she has worked a lot topic from the perspective of social psychology and environmental psychology, which is not, I found it was related to environmental issues, but is environmental in the sense of really the people, how they relate to the territory. And
yeah,
so
exactly.
Studies on how the two different levels are connected in terms of attitude to European Union.
Yeah, cool.
Well, a lot of ideas, but at the end is it is. So you're researching. You're continuing this research. This is the content of your project as a postdoc researcher.
No, this is still coming off since my PhD. So my main work now is really on AI regulation and contestation around AI data centers, local. Well, I started out actually wanting to see what contestation is happening in the EU level around this all of the AI things. For example, biometric surveillance. I've just finished a paper on that, but interestingly, that's not much, because it's so removed still, and it's not yet been, I think, reframed enough to get this type of traction. But where things are happening is at the local level around these centers that have these huge environmental impacts on people now and are quite tangible. And so, yeah, that's my postdoc is really on that. And yeah, this is still from what I did before. But we are, turning this into a short book, or have where we dropped the parties to some extent and added more movements. And take more of a Europeanization from below view.
Thank you. So is there any other question, comment? No? Well, okay, so maybe we can finish here. Thank you for joining us. Well, this was the last session of this academic year. I hope to see you again, at least in the audience, but maybe in the future on your presenting on your new research, which is also very interesting. I think really, really still underexplored. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining us. Well, we keep in touch.
Thank you all so much. That was really fun, and thank you for your comments. And yeah, hope to stay in touch and maybe meet in person at some point.
Exactly.
It'd be fun.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
nice end of the afternoon, and also particularly nice holidays when they come.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao.
The video will be online, so okay.
Are we still recording?
Yeah, I'm trying to turn off the the recording. Yeah.